Well, welcome to Sacred Thoughts Podcast. Here we are with episode one. Not going to do seasons. Wouldn't know how to go from one season to the next. Maybe it'd be a calendar year, but we're going to do episodes and we're going to carry this along and as long as we can. I've done iterations of podcasts in the past, particularly around my previous work with Prodigal Thought. But I have refocused, maybe some want to call it rebranded, under the title of Sacred Thoughts. I've got a Substack already up, sacredthoughts.substack.com. You can check that out. There's going to be free articles, of course. There will be free podcast episodes available. There'll be some paid podcast episodes, video content coming, and other things of that nature, maybe some short publications as well, thinking of some booklets under the title of Sacred Thoughts on various topics. And so here we are working with Sacred Thoughts on theology, spiritual formation, mental health, mission, and culture. Those are some things that I'm very passionate about. And so here we are, episode one. My plan is to get out 2 episodes a week. Now, sometimes it will only be one, but I want to try for 2 episodes. Sometimes they may be shorter, 20 minutes, let's say. Sometimes they may be lengthier, 40 minutes, maybe upwards of an hour. And this is why on the longer ones in particular, I do have plans to have guests on. I've already got a couple lined up in later summer into the fall and still working on that. People who are Christian thinkers will have who have been publishing, who have been writing, who have their own works out there, podcasts and various other things. And so looking forward to that. I've got my setup here. I don't know if this is a permanent setup, but you could see I've got my laptop, my extra screen, my new podcast mic. I was told just start with Snowball, Blue Snowball. So that's what I went with. I've got my cup of coffee and I've got my lit candle. I love candles in a sense of just bringing peace and calm. And so here we are. I just moved house maybe a month ago. And once we got settled in this house, I immediately went off to Scotland, to the University of Aberdeen, where I'm doing my PhD, writing my dissertation, or as they would say in the UK, the thesis. And so I've been working on that for a few years now and hoping, Lord willing, 2025 to finish. And so we're not too far from 2025, but I'm thinking more on the back end of 2025. I'll be finished. Particularly, I'm looking at, I guess you could say, how spiritual formation and mission come together, merge together, meet together. And particularly, I'm looking through the lens of what I use is the word is enculturation. Some people may be more familiar with the word contextualization. But I'm going to use the word enculturation. I've kind of been inputted into me, and I think it's a pretty fair perspective, or at least giving some space to pull apart contextualization and enculturation. And so, contextualization more being the theological foundation of understanding how we relate in our world or our context today, which is very different from, let's say, 30 years ago, which is very different from definitely 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, when the Bible was, or various writings that became the canon of Scripture were coming together. It's also very different from even today in 2024 with some place, let's say, across the world. And I've been to various other places, lived in other countries, as well as traveled. America, the West, is very different. Even America is different from other parts of the West. However, think of it not just time-wise and faraway place today, but a faraway place from those of the biblical times, what we might call the Middle East. And so we've got to think about a lot of things when it comes to contextualization. There's a lot of theological thought that's out there. However, secondly, enculturation, which I'm more passionate about, is the practice of the actual practical reality of going into a culture to be with the people, to listen, to learn from, to share with, that with a perspective missionally. So this is where mission and spiritual formation come together. There's a missional perspective as we enculturate, but to learn and listen from, as one writer said, to be evangelized before we evangelize, to be evangelized by the people that we're a part of. And so I want to look at, or what I am looking at in my research, is how enculturation is a spiritually formative practice, not in the people that we go to, but in our lives as we go amongst other people groups. And I just want to reiterate, that doesn't mean across the ocean, across the world. That could be around the corner. And so, yeah, I moved, went straight to Aberdeen after I got settled, and had a wonderful PhD symposium there for a few days. Wasn't in the country very long, which is sad. And so here we are. That's kind of setting the scene for me, Scott Linky, for Sacred Thoughts and the work that I'm doing now, my own research, my own passions, and so forth. And so for this first episode, what I want to talk about over the next few minutes is the idea of what I will call the church in exile. That's something I guess I would say I have a passion, is helping people today, particularly the church in America, in understanding what it means for the church to be in exile. Now, that's weird language. If you're familiar with the Old Testament, the word exile should not be unfamiliar. We see this as we get towards the end of the Old Testament, towards the end of some of the historical accounts, like in Kings or Chronicles, but you also see it throughout the prophets, where Israel and Judah, after they've split, and particularly, um, I like to sum up their sins, their wrongs, their evils, their grievances amongst God, or God's grievances with them, is kind of threefold. And the first one is the idolatry. Uh, in Old Testament, ancient context, ancient Mesopotamia, what we now call Middle East, and so forth. Well, idolatry may be run through the idea of other literal gods that were recognized, like Molech, Chemosh, Baal or Baal, and things of that nature, which were a lot of times recognized through things that have been built of wood, of stone, perhaps of precious metals, that were people would bow to these and recognize these gods. We're not so much struggling with that in the Western world, that kind of idolatry. We are struggling more with what I like to call the isms, the things that we give our affections to, our hearts to, our bodies to, our brains, our minds. And those isms are things like consumerism, materialism. We want stuff, we want lots of stuff, consume it, consume it, consume it. Uh, Perhaps in many ways, although you could say there's a shift in the West, but modernism and the kind of post-Enlightenment modernist way of understanding truth and reality, which was a very cerebral thing, as if we were just brains on sticks, but we are holistic beings, but our giving to the different isms. And even if we don't make isms, we still give our hearts and our affections to many things, making them idolatrous. Politics, specific economic ideas, um, particular philosophies. And so Israel, Judah of old, idolatry. We have idolatry as well. It just looks a bit different. Secondly, would be unholy political alliances. And you see that in the Old Testament. You see that the prophets calling it out. Don't make pacts with these people. Egypt, Assyria. Oh, wait, King Hezekiah, you let a Babylon emissary into your whole kingdom, showed him the treasures and everything. Are you trying to form this alliance? What are you doing? Don't form an alliance with Syria just to the north. And things of that nature. Political alignments that hopefully would save their tails. And today, particularly in America, the unholy political alliances are with political platforms. And I have never, ever imagined, perhaps, yeah. Okay, I would have said, I would have maybe leaned this way in thinking politics was going to be one of the great ways for us to get things done as the church to accomplish what God wants in our world. But I'm not anti politics. Politics is all about um, really, if you look at the history of the word polis, where we get our idea of metropolis as a big city, polis is about the city, the people. Politics is about the people. And so, I want to be very clear. The gospel is very political. The good news that God has done what he said he would do, and he did it through Jesus Christ, his life, death, resurrection, and ascension. That's the most political statement the church can make, is proclaiming that Jesus is actual king, king of all. However, the church in the West, or let me say it this way, the church in America believes primarily, have taken in this idea that God somehow gets everything that he wants done primarily through a political platform. Now, we would never say it that way. We just act that way as we live out life. Here we are, have an election coming up in less than 5 months now. I think we have set ourselves up for just continual rage, outrage, anxiety, so much problems around politics. And we think whether if we are on the left and we believe that the Democratic platform is the way things should get done, if we're on the right and we think that the Republican platform is the way that things should get done, we have given our lives, our affections, our minds, our bodies to believe this is the way God gets things done. And that is our unholy political alliances. We get in the bed with politicians. It just doesn't happen on the right. Or if you're on the right, it doesn't just happen on the left. We would be crazy to think it only happens on one side of the aisle. And so, way, way back, political alliances with other nations to save Israel and Judah's tails, we are making these unholy political alliances ourselves with political platforms that we have in our world today. Okay, so idolatry, unholy political alliances, and then thirdly is oppressive ways. And you can see this very strongly in the prophets, calling out the oppression that was taking place, particularly to the marginalized, the poor, the people the have-nots, as people might call them. If there's one thing that I've found that really upsets God, I mean, very strongly upsets him, it's watching people get oppressed. And really, that's what happened going back all the way to the Exodus. We're talking about exile, but the Exodus, I mean, God was really, really, if I could use a language, ticked off of how Egypt was oppressing the Hebrews, the people that God had chose to bring forth his plan of redemption, his plan of making things good and right in our world, ultimately through the Messiah. And the Hebrew people, his people were being oppressed. And so here we are now, the tables have turned, and now it is Israel and Judah, particularly summed up through their leaders, that are oppressing the poor, the marginalized, the have-nots. Looking at our context today, looking over the last few centuries, we don't have a good track record. And it's not just America, it's the church in America that's been complicit in a lot of this stuff, from slavery, not just of Africans, but watching how native peoples were treated, have been treated. We can look at, and I'm grateful for the Emancipation Proclamation and so forth, and what was done under Abraham Lincoln. But if you look at a track record with native peoples, it's not very good. The way that women have been treated, the way that all types of minorities, religious, ethnic, if you want to use the word race, but also the LGBTQ community. We don't have to talk about what practices are right or wrong in the LGBTQ community at this point. Maybe it's something we could talk about, but what we have to recognize is all of these peoples have been hurt and damaged, have been oppressed, and it's not right, and it makes God upset. And therefore, what we are experiencing because of these three things, idolatry, unholy political alliances, and oppression, the church in America, I would claim, is in exile. Now, in the Old Testament time, to be exiled was to be taken out of the land. That's really Israel's story. If you even look back at Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and the story of humanity beginning, it's also really centered in on the beginning of Israel, the Hebrew people. And if you watch the disobedience of Adam and Eve, of the man and woman eating the fruit of the garden, guess what happens? They are exiled outside the land that they had been given as a gift, the garden. They are exiled outside the garden. And that's what happens at the end of the Old Testament. The people of God are exiled because of their heinous behavior. And God was not like, okay, you didn't have a quiet time this morning, I'm really pissed, I'm going to exile you. This is centuries and centuries of, again, I'm summarizing, we could probably say there are other things, or split some of these into subcategories, but these three things of idolatry, unholy political alliances, and oppression. And it's finally over and done with, their exile. But as I said, in the Old Testament, the kind of movement across it, exiled out of a land, taken to another place. We're not taken to another place. Okay? Will it happen? Perhaps. But that's neither here nor there. We have been exiled from the gift that we had. Interestingly, a people that had come to be free from religious oppression in Europe, who came to the Americas. And now the tables have been flipped, and we lived our own life of doing what we were trying to get free from, our ancestors, particularly people of kind of my ilk, more Caucasian, European descent. And so we are in exile. We are not in another land, but the gift that we had, they had a gift of land, in the ancient world, land and progeny, children, were huge and important. Okay? Here, we've lost the gift of our inheritance and the opportunities that we've had. We've used power in a very wrong way. And so being in exile, it's a hard thing. And here's what I want to do. I want to put a kind of an interim period or another period between. I've been talking about the Old Testament and ancient Israel and Judah. I've been talking about the American church today, perhaps at the end of the 20th century over into now the 21st century. But you can look at the same things with Western Europe, right? Christendom, the institutionalized Christianity. Well, look at their track record. It's very similar to America's, right? Three very heinous sins being committed: idolatry, unholy political alliances, okay, and oppression. And particularly, I know we would say in America, separation of church and state, but it happens again because we try and get our fingers in the pies of the Republican or Democratic platform, perhaps another party, Green Party or Libertarian or whatnot, but particularly run through this two major parties in America. And so Europe, it happened the same. And because of that unholy stuff, the terrible, heinous acts of Western Europe and the church, well, guess what? Christendom is obliterated, right? It's lost. Now, there are remnants of things, and we could talk about the idea of remnant in the Old Testament. There are remnants of good things, and hopefully at some point, Western Europe will come out of this exilic period, if you will, their own exile of losing everything they had, and see something beautiful and better come forth. But it's interesting, what is happening in America has already happened in Europe. And I kind of, having lived in Western Europe for 8.5 years, 3 years in the UK, although with Brexit, the UK is not officially Europe anymore, although they are playing in the Euros. They're not in, sorry, they are part of Europe. They're not part of the European Union, if that makes sense. And so England and Scotland are playing in the Euros 2024 summer soccer or football tournament happening this summer, which I love. But things happen in Western Europe. Okay. And I lived 3 years in the UK, 5.5 years in Belgium, and they kind of go in this arc up to the UK, cross over the Atlantic Ocean into Canada, down into the US, and finally, a long, long time later, into the southern states of the US, which is where I live, in the Bible Belt of America. And so we have people here, white knuckle, holding on to a bygone era as if it were still 1987 or something, or before that, to where as if America still is Christianity is still the majority in America, and so forth. But we're holding on to something that is being obliterated and will continue to be, and this exile will just be extended longer the more we fight it. We have lost. And so I've written in the past before about how we need to practice things like silence and lament and service is our primary ways of existing in the world. So if you look at Jeremiah, I think the book of Jeremiah is a very prophetic book for today, in the sense, and I'm not some goofy prophetic book, end times kind of stuff. What I mean is it is able to speak, I think, into the church's predicament today, because Jeremiah is kind of writing this deep lament. And then there's the book of Lamentations, who some would say was written by Jeremiah, but whomever it was written by. And you look at that and you watch it. Matter of fact, Jeremiah 29, people love to quote Jeremiah 29:11 as kind of a life verse. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you, plans for a future and a hope. But if you look at that whole chapter, Jeremiah writes a letter to the exiles far away, now over in Babylon. And it's written to a people, not individual. Most of the time, the word you in the Bible is a plural you, it's not an individual you. And so, if you look at that whole chapter, he writes this letter and he says, hey, you're over there far away. God says right now that you need to live, build homes, marry amongst the people, live life there. You're going to be there. You're going to be there 70 years. And you need to consider that things have been totally changed. Again, I'll use the word your faith, your temple, your city, your land is obliterated. Make life there. And here we are. What we have in America has been, is being destroyed in the sense of any kind of central majority faith, the institution of Christendom in America. And we can white knuckle it and fight it, okay? To try and hold on to a bygone era. Or we can, as I said, practice things like silence, lament, and service as a way to be in our society and to live practicing humility. But we don't want that. We want to fight. Watch, think of the elections as they continue to build. I think we've set ourselves up for, doesn't matter who wins this November. Doesn't matter. The election will be stolen somehow. Those votes shouldn't have been counted. These votes should have been counted and they weren't. And we're just going to have lots and lots of fighting. And again, just holding on to these unholy political alliances that, interestingly, the early church, if you want to think about them, they had no concept of being able to influence Rome, the empire, the emperor. But they got on with doing the things of Jesus. Not perfectly, but a lot better, a lot more faithful than we have been. And so we are in exile. Israel and Judah of old, three things. Okay, idolatry, unholy political alliances, oppression. They were exiled. Western Europe, over the past few centuries, the same stuff. Their own idolatry, okay, their own unholy political alliances, particularly recognized in state churches and the wielding of power to then also oppress groups and peoples that didn't line up. And then here we are in our own setting and context, the American church, same situation, in exile. Western Europe weren't taken to a land far away. America, not taken to a land far away. So that may not make us think of exile, but I think it's the best way to describe what is happening. And until, again, we let go and stop trying to hold on to this bygone era, we recognize through our silence and lament our most heinous, terrible ways and practices. And with that, we come out serving, humbly serving, washing feet. Perhaps we can sprinkle the good news in fresh and new ways, but I'm not convinced it's going to happen. And I don't plan to see anything new, beautiful, and fresh happen. Definitely, I'm 44, almost 45. Maybe I got hopefully 40 more years. Definitely not. My children and grandchildren, I'm not so sure. Because really, there's nothing going on in Western Europe, and they've been in this situation a long, long time. You could argue that in the 1700s, things started, definitely the 1800s, with the Enlightenment, secularism, and so forth, and the obliteration of Christendom in Europe. They've been at it for a couple of centuries now, at least. We're just in the beginnings of our own, maybe a few decades. We've got to find a way forward. Letting go of these three grievous sins and taking up these three beautiful practices. Letting go of and repenting of the things of idolatry, unholy political alliances, and oppression. And we take up the three practices of silence, lament, and service. Servanthood. I think we'll see some changes. So there you go, episode 1. Those are my sacred thoughts about the church in America, where we're at today, where we've been going, where we've come from, and where we will be going in the coming years and decades, most likely, if not longer. So I hope you'll check out my Substack, sacredthoughts.substack.com. Subscribe. There is a paid subscription as well. You can do the free subscription. There's a paid subscription as well, $5 a month, $50 for the year. That will get you some content that will be available that won't be available to the free subscribers. So if you can support the work. Until next time, thank you for joining me on Sacred Thoughts.